The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
To Nixon, the emergence of the imperial presidency. I would like to take a moment of your time to inform you if you find the range of lectures, concerts, theater, and poetry events which the Y currently offers of interest, you may also find these smaller, intellectually rigorous and challenging courses of interest too. These classes begin the week of October 15th. I urge you to register soon while there is still space available. A call to the Y's Education Department will answer any of your questions. Now, on to the evening before us. For those of you who were here last week, you have met Dr. Richard Pious. For those of you who were not, let me provide a brief word of introduction. A faculty member of the Political Science Department at Barnard College and on the graduate faculties of Columbia University, Dr. Pious is the author of The American Presidency, The Power to Govern, and Presidents, Congress, and the Constitution. Following our lecture this evening, Professor Pious will again conduct a brief, moderated conversation with Professor Leuchtenburg. Finally, members of the audience will be able to submit written questions on the index cards which you received as you entered the hall. If you pass the cards to the center aisles, ushers will collect them during the moderated conversation and bring them backstage for presentation. Our distinguished lecturer this evening is William E. Leuchtenburg. Currently, William Rand Keenan, Jr., Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Professor Leuchtenburg's list of accomplishments and affiliations is long and impressive. From 1956 until 1983, he held the position DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia University. Previously, he taught at Harvard, Smith, and New York universities. Professor Leuchtenburg has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Mellon Senior Fellow, a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson for International Affairs, and the National Humanities Center, to name but a few. Among his many publications are In the Shadow of FDR, From Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan, War and Social Change in the 20th Century America, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. This last having won the Bancroft Prize and the Francis Parkman Prize of the Society of American Historians. His works have been translated into Japanese, Italian, Hebrew, and Portuguese. Professor Leuchtenburg's articles and reviews have appeared in numerous journals, including The Nation, The New Republic, Political Science Quarterly, The Atlantic Monthly, and the New York Times Book Review. At present, Professor Leuchtenburg is writing a major book on the legitimization of the growth of the state in 20th century America, focusing on FDR and the Supreme Court crisis of 1937, which will be published by Oxford University Press. And he's also working on the final volume of the Oxford History of the United States. Through his scholarly work, Professor Leuchtenburg is recognized as one of the foremost scholars of the American presidency. In view of this, we are therefore honored that he is with us for this series. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to turn the lectern over to our distinguished speaker, Professor William E. Leuchtenburg.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. On April 12, 1945, Vice President Harry Truman was presiding in the Senate over a long, dull debate on a water treaty. When the debate ended, shortly before sunset, he made his way over to the office of Sam Rayburn to join his friends for their usual afternoon round of bourbon and branch water. As he strolled into the Speaker's office for his drink, the Vice President was summoned to the phone. The White House was calling. Mr. Truman was to come over immediately. Truman, not knowing what the message entailed, but sensing its urgency, raced through an underground tunnel, ordered a car, and unescorted rode down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. When he got there, Mrs. Roosevelt came up to him, put her arm on his shoulder, and said, "Harry, the president is dead." Franklin D. Roosevelt had died that afternoon in Warm Springs, Georgia. After a moment of shock, Truman recovered himself to ask Mrs. Roosevelt, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." That was an odd remark to make to someone who had just ascended to the highest office in the land. But no one felt its truth more than Truman. He treated his elevation as a disaster that had befallen him. He knew in particular that he faced one overwhelming obstacle, that so accustomed had the country become to FDR in the White House that anyone else there seemed an imposter. Many Americans could not remember the time when there'd been anyone in the White House but Roosevelt. And they'd assumed, without thinking about it, that he'd be there forever. In the 1944 campaign, the Chicago Daily News said of Roosevelt, "If he was good enough for my pappy and my grandpappy, he's good enough for me." According to one story that circulated that year, a man said to a loyal Democrat who had just become father of a baby boy, "Maybe he'll grow up to be president." "Why?" the man growled. "What's the matter with Roosevelt?" By the time of his death, Roosevelt had become the only conceivable model of what a president should be. When Dorothy Rosenman, the wife of the presidential speechwriter, went to the White House for the first time in the Truman era, she immediately sensed that there was something terribly wrong. Then she recognized what it was. She had never before known a president who could walk. And Truman's ability to walk seemed an abnormality. Many of the New Deal luminaries who had been close to Roosevelt were appalled by the turn of events. David Lilienthal, the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, wrote in his journal his response to the news of Roosevelt's death. Complete unbelief, that was the first. Then a sick, hopeless feeling. Then consternation at the thought of that throttle bottom Truman. The country and the world doesn't deserve to be left this way, with Truman at the head of the country at such a time. 5 months later, on hearing Truman wisecracking in the doorway of his office, Lilienthal noted, "The remark epitomizes the humor of the Middle West. It's barber shops and filling stations where men pass the time of day. But can you imagine a Groton president saying that?" FDR's humor had a different kind of expression. Also, FDR laughed. Truman grins broadly, and he does laugh, but it's so fleeting that it's hardly a laugh at all. A chuckle, or more, the sound effect of a grin. Often Truman did not receive even the minimal respect due to a man who held the same office that Roosevelt had adorned. At the White House funeral, where 200 FDR loyalists paid the late president homage, Truman entered the room and nobody rose. On his first morning in office, he phoned the RFC administrator, Jesse Jones, to report that the president had appointed a St. Louis man to be federal loan administrator. Did he make the appointment before he died? Jones asked. No, Truman replied, he made it just now. As Truman himself later noted, everyone, including myself, still continued to think of Roosevelt as the president. Truman, though, was, as Mrs. Roosevelt said, in trouble now, not merely because he was in the shadow of FDR, but also because he got chewed up in the clash of interest groups in the difficult process of reconversion from a wartime to a peacetime and then back to a Cold War economy. Truman inherited all of the consequences of the pressure group state that had grown up under Roosevelt, and he had to operate it in a much less auspicious time. As one historian has observed, whereas the politics of depression generally allowed the Roosevelt administration, by bestowing benefits to court interest groups and contribute to an economic upturn, the politics of inflation required a responsible government like Truman's to curb wages, prices, and profits, and to deny the growing expectations of rival groups. Inevitably, that was an approach that, however necessary, was bound to antagonize almost everyone. You had to tell every group in America, including those like labor who were part of your own coalition, that they could not have what they wanted if prices were to remain stable. In Truman's first term, for example, New York City lost its historic subway fare of a nickel, and the cost of a subway ride rose to a shocking level, 10 cents. So that you had at one and the same time the irritation of trying to impose your will on groups in the coalition and still not being able to keep prices stable. By 1946, only a year after Truman took office, he was already so unpopular that in the midterm congressional election campaign that year, the Democratic Party chairman told Truman to stay out of sight. And the party relied on recordings of Franklin Roosevelt's voice instead. When in November, the Democrats lost control of Congress for the first time in 16 years, that is, since before the era of FDR, prominent Democrats suggested that Truman resign from office on the spot. And like a British prime minister who had lost a vote of confidence, not serve out the remaining years of his office. Truman, of course, paid no attention to this movement, which was led by Senator Fulbright. In fact, ever thereafter, he referred to him as Senator Half-Bright. These 1946 elections created an extraordinary situation. Truman became the first president in this century to have to cope with a Congress with both houses controlled by the opposition party. From the outset, Truman had hoped to develop a much more cooperative relationship with Congress than Roosevelt had had, in part because, as a recent senator, he still thought of himself as one of them. So far did he carry this notion that on his first full day as president, he went up to Capitol Hill for lunch and started to walk out on the Senate floor. "You can't go out there, Harry," an aide had to remind him. "You're president now." Despite these efforts at cooperation, he got very little accomplished during the period of Democratic reign in 1945-46. And now he faced a Congress with both houses controlled by the Republicans. In the field of foreign affairs, Truman's cooperative attitude did pay dividends, especially in his willingness to make concessions to Senator Vandenberg to put through the Marshall Plan. But in domestic policy, the Republican 80th Congress, under the leadership of Robert Taft, fought him tooth and nail. He had no hope at all in such a Congress of putting through any of his own programs, and he was reduced to rearguard actions to defend the legacy of the New Deal from the attacks of the Republicans led by Taft. Highly intelligent, but exceptionally parochial, Taft, it was said, had the best mind in the United States Senate until he made it up. Taft's main opus in the new Congress was a new labor bill, the Taft-Hartley Act, which was a response to the torrent of anti-union sentiment in the country. That year, a former Air Force lieutenant, after having strangled his bride and pounded her head with a rock, explained she liked labor unions. In June 1947, Truman sent a 5,400-word message vetoing the Taft-Hartley bill. But while the reading was going on, one Republican leader conspicuously made it known that he wasn't listening, while another studiously read the comic pages from the Washington Post. When the reading ended, there were boos and cries of "vote, vote." In short order, Congress overrode Truman's veto, as it was to override his veto of other important legislation. Truman also made trouble for himself by the way that he dealt with the media. He did not hold press conferences nearly as often as FDR did, and he was prone to snap remarks that caused him difficulty, such as referring to the Hiss case as a red herring, or agreeing that the Korean effort was a police action. Sometimes, too, Truman seemed uninformed. On one occasion, he referred repeatedly to the Tennessee Valley Authority as the TWA. Finally, a reporter interjected, "Don't you mean TVA, Mr. President? TWA is an airline." Truman's troubles persisted, year in, year out. In 1948, a number of liberal Democrats, including prominent members of the Roosevelt family, took part in a Dump Truman movement to deny him the presidential nomination that year. And the New Republic featured in bold letters on its blue-inked cover the words, "Truman should quit." His second term was even rougher. Saddled with the blame for an unpopular war in Korea and for the scandals that rocked his administration, Truman saw his approval rating in the polls fall to an abysmal 23%, the lowest that has ever been recorded before or since. Not even on the eve of his resignation in disgrace did Richard Nixon sink that low. The situation today, though, is strikingly different. In 1984, in this year, when we commemorate the 100th anniversary of Truman's birth, the popular attitude toward Harry Truman is not at all what it was in his own day. In the mid-1970s, the country was swept by a tidal wave of approval for the former president that Time magazine labeled Trumania. And there's no sign that the popular enthusiasm has significantly ebbed. At its zenith, Trumania took a remarkable variety of forms. James Whitmore's impersonation, Give 'em Hell Harry, played to standing room only. Merrill Miller's oral history, Plain Speaking, was a runaway bestseller. Stuckey's reported that when it offered presidential plates for sale at its roadside shops, Truman was the #1 choice. And the rock group Chicago brought down the house with its lyrics, America needs you, Harry Truman. Harry, could you please come home? Even more emphatic is the assessment of Truman by historians. Despite the fluctuations in popular opinion, the historical profession has given Truman high ratings each time it has been surveyed. In 1962, a poll of historians conducted by the senior Arthur Schlesinger put him in 8th place among all American presidents. His near great ranking bracketed him with Theodore Roosevelt and Andrew Jackson. Truman, Schlesinger Sr. said, had discharged impressively the awesome obligations devolving on the United States as the leader of the free world. 20 years later, a few more chief executives had come and gone, but 3 new polls, one of them published just last year, found Truman still resting securely in 8th place, and once more characterized as near great. Even in the early years, when Truman was most in popular disfavor, historians gave him very good marks. One of the first of the chroniclers, Henry Steele Commager, predicted that the historian of the early 21st century would look back on the Truman administration as one of almost uninterrupted and unparalleled success. In 1955, Commager's longtime Columbia colleague, Alan Nevins, wrote, "What a cocky, decisive person he is, with an instinct for the right act in major affairs, worth tons of formal education. And what a down-to-earth Missouri farmer outlook he kept through all his ascendancy. A unique figure in our political annals." 5 years later, Clinton Rossiter, who was already ranking Truman among the top 8 American presidents, wrote, "I am ready to hazard an opinion, to which I came, I confess manfully, with dragging feet, that Harry S. Truman will eventually win a place as president alongside Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt." More recently, Robert Farrell has concluded that it was Truman who preserved the Republic into our own time. Now, how can one account for this? How can one explain why Truman, who was in such trouble through almost all his days in office, and held in such low esteem then, now ranked so highly? There are several explanations. First of all, Truman has impressed historians by markedly amplifying the office of the president. At the end of World War II, the White House staff numbered 45. When Truman left office, 250, an increase of more than 500%. But that's the least of it. In less than 8 years under Truman, Congress unified the armed forces under the Department of Defense in the Pentagon, gave the Joint Chiefs of Staff legal status, and created a panoply of new agencies: the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Council of Economic Advisors. All of these were born under Truman. By January 1947, the President was sending 3 separate messages to Congress: State of the Union, Budget, and Economic Report. While welcoming many of these developments, Truman made clear that he would permit none to infringe upon his own prerogatives. For example, to demonstrate that he was rejecting the notion that Congress could require him to seek the advice of the National Security Council before acting, he made a point of attending its meetings only irregularly. Again and again, Truman was heard to say, "I mean to pass this office on to my successor unimpaired." In the age of Roosevelt, liberals had become accustomed to equating the expansion of the presidency with social gains. But not all of the changes during the Truman years were in a progressive direction. In particular, Truman instituted a loyalty program to inquire into the political beliefs and associations of federal employees, irrespective of whether they were in sensitive posts. It was Truman's Attorney General, too, who launched the prosecution of Communist Party leaders under the Smith Act. Truman did, though, insist that when congressmen demanded personnel records from departments, that he have the final say on whether they would go. Furthermore, Truman struck a number of important blows for the supremacy of civilian government over the military. He battled with the Air Force over expenditures for bombers, and he warred with the Navy when he impounded funds for a supercarrier. On one occasion, Truman said, "For your information, the Marine Corps is just the Navy's police force, and as long as I'm president, that's what it will remain. They have a propaganda machine that's almost equal to Stalin's." By all odds, though, the most important step that Truman took in this regard was his dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur. That was a necessary act on behalf of the principle of civilian supremacy over the military and on behalf of the conception of limited war. But Truman well knew that so popular was the general, his action would cost him dearly. There were to be, in fact, cries for Truman's impeachment, and his opponents hung flags at half-mast from coast to coast. Truman, however, would not shirk the task that lay before him. Shortly before his announcement was to be made, a young White House aide suggested that Truman could protect himself. by explaining that he was acting with the unanimous approval of his advisors. "Son, not tonight," Truman replied. "Tonight, I am taking this decision on my own responsibility as President of the United States, and I want nobody to think I am sharing it. Tonight, it's my decision and mine alone." Indeed, far from being a weak president, Truman sometimes stretched the powers of his office to questionable lengths. He took the country into the Korean War solely on his own initiative. In his study of the presidency, Professor Pious has put the matter very well. He writes, "Truman did so even though there had been no attacks on American forces or citizens. There was no immediate request for intervention from the South Korean government. There was no call for such intervention from the United Nations, and there was no American commitment to defend the territorial integrity of South Korea." What is at issue here, it should be stressed, is not the wisdom of going into Korea, but whether Truman had the authority for what he did. During the war, Truman shocked the country by a bold action, seizing the nation's privately owned steel mills, to end a strike and to reach a settlement in accord with the government's wage price policy. In justification, one of his appointees made the most sweeping claims for the right of an executive to exercise his will absolutely unchecked. Subsequently, the Supreme Court required Truman to return the mills to the owners. And as Professor Pious has noted, no later president has ever again been able to use the threat of such action. Truman's performance in these instances, though, however ill-advised, does not suggest the weak president he was once caricatured as being. Indeed, in any history of the American presidency, Harry Truman holds a very large place. Truman is put in the near great category not only because of his impact on the office of the president, but also because, in retrospect, his administration is seen as a time of achievement, when new policies were hammered out, and legislation and executive action brought about significant change. In 1945, many feared that the United States was headed toward another post-war reaction, such as the one that had followed the First World War under Warren Harding. But Truman successfully defended the legacy of the New Deal and challenged Congress with recommendations for a battery of new FDR-style reforms. Furthermore, he made his own contribution by developing the program of the Fair Deal. Not much came of it, but he could claim some modest triumphs: expansion of Social Security, a rise in the minimum wage, expanded public housing. One of Truman's more memorable achievements in the legislative field was a bill to admit displaced persons to the United States. As is unhappily true of much of Truman's record, his performance was not all that it could have been or should have been. Nonetheless, it was Truman who in 1945 issued a directive ordering that preference in immigration be given to displaced persons, an order that resulted in the admission of 41,000 refugees, two-thirds of them Jews, who kept an advisor on Jewish affairs on the White House staff, whom he encouraged to press for new legislation, who in 1947 sent a special message to Congress urging the admission of a, quote, substantial number of displaced persons to America, and who in 1950 got through Congress a considerably more satisfactory Displaced Persons Act. Truman also set the agenda for future administrations by calling for federal aid to education, civil rights statutes, and national health insurance. When in the 1960s, each of these programs came to fruition, President Johnson made a sentimental voyage to independence to sign the Medicare bill into law, while a pleased Truman looked on. In the domestic realm, surely Truman's greatest historic importance comes from the fact that he was the first American president of this century to identify himself with the elimination of racial discrimination. In December 1946, he set up a President's Committee on Civil Rights, which in October 1947 issued its landmark report to secure these rights, recommending a series of changes in racial practices. Congress frustrated each of his efforts to gain new legislation. But Truman, and this is another example of the mark that he made on the presidency, used his executive power in a number of ways to bring about change. He issued an executive order banning discrimination in federal employment, appointed the first blacks to federal judgeships, stepped up the pace of desegregation of the armed forces, was the first president to campaign in Harlem, integrated the inauguration ceremonies in 1949, and authorized his representatives to go before the Supreme Court to urge action against discrimination. One consequence was a historic decision by the Supreme Court against restrictive covenants, a device that was used to prevent not only blacks but Jews from moving into restricted neighborhoods. Truman would not have been able either to have had as much impact on the office of the president or to have advanced so much new legislation if he had not succeeded in winning election to a second term. Virtually no one thought that Truman had a chance in 1948. The 1946 election suggested that he was already in dire trouble. And on top of that, the left wing of his party split off to form the Progressive Party under Henry Wallace, and the right wing, the Dixiecrats, or States' Rights Party, under Strom Thurmond. In these circumstances, how could Truman possibly win? But Truman had two things going for him. One was that he was the candidate of the majority party, benefiting from the coalition that FDR had put together, a coalition largely of lower-income voters. The other was that his opponent was Thomas E. Dewey, who was something less than a magnetic personality. Many recalled Alice Roosevelt Longworth's jibe at the proper, mustached, short-statured Dewey. He looks like the bridegroom on a wedding cake. Dewey's cautious campaign served to accentuate his colorlessness. Dewey went after the presidency, one critic noted, with the humorless calculation of a certified public accountant in pursuit of the Holy Grail. And Dewey uttered one sentence that will live forever in the annals of political oratory. Our future lies before us. But Harry Truman also made his own contribution to the ultimate outcome by electrifying the Democratic National Convention with the announcement that he was calling Congress back into special session that summer to enact a series of recommendations. The president told the delegates, "I'm going to call the Congress back, and I'm going to ask them to pass laws halting rising prices and to meet the housing crisis, which they say, therefore, in their platform. At the same time, I shall ask them to act on aid to education, which they say, therefore, a national health program, civil rights legislation, which they say, therefore, an increase in the minimum wage, which I doubt very much, therefore, an adequate and decent law for displaced persons in place of the anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic law which this 80th Congress passed." They can do this job in 15 days if they want to. To rub it in even more, Truman announced that he was picking a particular day for the reconvening of Congress in a hot Washington summer. The particular day he chose for no better reason than that was the day in which turnips are planted in Missouri. Not since Franklin Pierce in 1856 had a president called back Congress in an election year. One Republican senator fumed, "This petulant Ajax from the Ozarks will find the maddest Congress you ever saw." He was right. The turnip Congress passed nothing of consequence. But Truman had scored his point, that the real issue was not Dewey's reasonably moderate record, nor the fairly advanced Republican national platform, but the hard rock conservatism of the Republican delegation in Congress. And that permitted him to wage his whistle-stop campaign that fall against the do-nothing, good-for-nothing 80th Congress. Still, almost nobody thought he could make it. Newsweek polled 60 correspondents. All 60 said Truman would lose. All the polls predicted a Truman defeat. One of the leading pollsters, Roper, even stopped taking opinion surveys 2 months before November because there was just no point in it. I confess that this was my own view. In 1948, I was in Kansas City managing the first campaign for Congress of Richard Bowling. And I wrote home to my office in Washington that though I thought Bowling was a fine man, I had doubts about his political judgment because there were times when he spoke as though Truman might win. But in fact, as you know, in the greatest upset in American political history, Truman pulled it out, giving the Democratic Party and the Roosevelt-Truman programs 4 more years of life. The Republicans, who'd been all but guaranteed victory, had sustained a humiliating defeat. Dewey, it was said, had snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory. The Republicans had bought their homes in Georgetown, and now, without ever having lived in them, had to sell them. They had placed their children in private schools in Washington and now had to withdraw them. Worst of all, they had appropriated a record $250,000 for the forthcoming inauguration. And now they had to watch Truman spend it. Certain of victory after 16 years out of power, they were now going to have to tolerate 4 more years of Democratic rule. The only way a Republican will get into the White House, said Groucho Marx, is to marry Margaret Truman. The pollsters, too, had been humiliated. Stealing a line from Henri IV, Le Figaro ran a headline, "Brave Gallop, go hang yourself." Disillusioned with the polls, one elderly lady turned to her companion on a Chicago bus and said, "Now I don't know whether to believe even the Kinsey report." And there are, it might be said parenthetically, not a few Americans this year who are trusting that Truman's experience will not be unique. Truman's main claim to historical significance in the area of policy, though, comes not in the domestic scene, but in international affairs. And here we're confronted by a conundrum. The majority of scholars who work in this field, that is to say, the diplomatic historians, have overwhelmingly adopted a new left view that is strongly critical of Truman's behavior and assigns to him a large, even the major share of responsibility for the Cold War. Yet the historic profession as a whole nonetheless scores him as near great, apparently because it is unpersuaded by the judgments of the specialists and more impressed by the array of new departures in foreign affairs in his presidency. The birth of the United Nations, the occupation of Germany and Japan, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Japanese Peace Treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance and NATO, and the Point 4 program of aid to the Third World. 3 episodes may serve very quickly to suggest the range of Truman's performance in foreign policy. One is his handling of the Palestine question. In June, I was invited to Israel to give the Truman Centennial Lecture at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I spoke at the Truman Institute, a name that suggests the high regard in which Truman is held in Israel, and understandably so. In his years in the White House, Truman frequently irritated people by his unwillingness to move more swiftly to support the aspirations for a Jewish homeland. And in more than one instance, he faltered. Yet there can be no doubt, in retrospect, that in no small part, because of his early partnership with Eddie Jacobson and a Kansas City haberdashery, he did sympathize with and abetted the Zionist cause. As early as August 1945, only 4.5 months after he took office, he urged Prime Minister Attlee to permit 100,000 Jews to migrate into what was then Palestine. And it was, of course, Truman who granted de facto recognition to the new state of Israel, only minutes after its proclamation was announced. In his relations to Europe, Truman faced a task so monumental that Dean Acheson has likened it to the first chapter of Genesis. To help the free world emerge from chaos without blowing the whole world apart in the process. Perhaps nothing illustrates so well Truman's success in carrying out this difficult dual assignment as a success of the Berlin Airlift. At the time, the New Statesman and Nation wrote, "Every expert knows that aircraft cannot be relied upon to provision Berlin over the winter months." Yet all through the winter of 1948-49, American and British planes ferried food, coal, and other material into the beleaguered capital. In May 1949, after 321 days of an airlift in which pilots had flown 277,000 missions and brought more than 2 million tons to the city by air, more than a ton for each Berliner, the Soviets capitulated and rail lines and highways into the city were reopened, and with no blood shed. Yet impressive though that performance was, it is the Marshall Plan, undeniably, that is Truman's monument in foreign affairs. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe had become, in Winston Churchill's words, a rubble heap, a charnel house, a breeding ground of pestilence and hate. And the financial editor of Reuters wrote, "The biggest crash since the fall of Constantinople, the collapse of the heart of Europe, impends." To avert this threatened disaster, Truman asked Congress for billions of dollars, and Congress, not without misgivings, responded. The plan proved to be a spectacular triumph. It met and surpassed every production target. By 1952, output in Europe was 200% higher than before the war. In London, The Economist stated, "Marshall aid is the most straightforward, generous thing that any country has ever done for others, the fullest expression so far of the American idealism on which all the hopes of the West depend." No doubt that statement is extravagant, but Churchill was even more grandiloquent about the president's record in the international realm. "I must confess, sir," Churchill told Truman over dinner in 1952, "I loathed your taking the place of Franklin Roosevelt." He paused, then added, "I misjudged you badly. Since that time, you, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization." That is, of course, as I've indicated, a judgment that has been vigorously disputed. But the range of activities in foreign affairs goes far to explain why Truman now has so high a rating. There's one other consideration. Historians tend to focus, not unreasonably, on policies more than personality. And certain of Truman's policies, civil rights, the Marshall Plan, assure him an enduring place in history, while others are open to criticism. But the Watergate experience especially has taught us that policy is not all that matters, and that Truman exhibited characteristics of probity and responsibility without which democratic society cannot survive. As Gerald Johnson has said, government must at all cost be conducted with honesty and courage, or it will inevitably blow up, as the United States exploded when Watergate exposed the perfidy and mendacity that had been rampant in Washington. Johnson goes on to say of Truman, "Croesus couldn't buy or the devil scare him." There was, in truth, much that was admirable about Truman's character and temperament. He was very much his own man. Truman once wrote a memo, "I wonder how far Moses would have gone if he'd taken a poll of Egypt." It isn't polls or public opinion of the moment that counts. It's right and wrong. In the aftermath of Watergate especially, the country came to treasure Harry Truman's special qualities: integrity, spunk, directness. And historians were confirmed in their earlier judgments. In his well-worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Truman had underlined, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." A man of scrupulous honesty, Truman insisted, when he wrote personal letters from the White House, on buying his own stamps and pasting them on. Truman had, too, an instinctive aversion to people he called counterfeits. His grandfather had counseled him that whenever you hear someone praying conspicuously loudly, you'd better go home and lock up your smokehouse. Simple in manner, he was no less straightforward in speech. Nixon, he once said, was a shifty-eyed goddamn liar. When a woman, offended by his use of the word manure, asked his wife, "Bess, couldn't you get the president to say fertilizer?" The First Lady replied, "Heavens no, it took me 25 years to get him to say manure." Above all, at a time of apprehension about the imperial presidency, Truman's modest view of himself was refreshing. At his reunion breakfast with his World War I outfit, Battery D, on Inauguration Day, 1949, Truman said, "We'll have none of that now. When I get on those striped pants and that top hat, you can call me Mr. President. But here, and at all such reunion occasions, you can make it just Captain Harry." That same month, he told the Democratic Finance Committee, "I'm just an ordinary human being who's been lucky, or unlucky, whichever way you want to look at it. And I've always said that I'm sure there are a million men in the United States, no doubt, who could do the job better than I can or could do it. But I have the job, I have to do it, and the rest of you have to help me." Sometime after he left the White House, a reporter asked him whether he'd not become a bit less feisty. "Not in the slightest," Truman answered. "They're trying to make a statesman out of me, and they'll never succeed." He meant it, too. When he visited Athens in 1964, he refused to look at a life-size statue of himself not far from the hotel, because he thought it improper to erect statues of living persons. Truman was also a man who, unlike a number of other recent presidents, had a keen sense of history. Which was a very vivid presence to him. One day in the 1950s, Truman came to Columbia University to speak, where I was then teaching, and I had breakfast with him at the apartment of the political scientist Richard Pious, who had been on the White House staff. Truman devoured his ham and eggs and grits, sat down at the piano and picked out a tune, and then began to talk. He spoke in particular with considerable wrath about that man Douglas. I knew that he did not always agree with Paul Douglas, the senator from Illinois, but I was surprised that he felt so venomous toward him. Then I slowly recognized that he was not talking about Paul Douglas at all. He was talking about Stephen Douglas, the mid-19th century senator from Illinois, who was as alive to him as though the controversies of the 1850s, a century before, were contemporary. Truman had a particularly strong awareness of all those historical figures who had a grandiose view of themselves, who lusted for power, who would use any means to grasp power. He was determined not to be one of their number. He wrote his daughter, "To be a good president, I fear a man can't be his own mentor. He can't live the Sermon on the Mount. He must be a Machiavelli, Louis XI, Caesar, Borgia, Talleyrand, a liar, double-crosser, and an unctuous religio, Richelieu, a hero and whatnot to be successful. But I probably won't be, thanks be to God, but I'm trying the opposite approach. Maybe it'll win." Inevitably, a final question arises. Given all that has just been said, is it possible that historians in the future will rank Truman still higher in the category of the great presidents? The question may imply more confidence in terminology like great than is warranted. Often polls of historians reveal more about the ideological disposition of the profession than they do about the substance of history. And it's far from clear what a term such as greatness means. Nonetheless, we do all carry around some such nomenclature in our heads, and however imprecisely, imply it all the time. Is it possible, then, that Truman is likely to be admitted by historians in the future into that special category of great presidents, a group that now includes only Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Washington? Not likely, I think. If anything, Truman today is probably a somewhat overpriced stock in the historical market. Quite apart from the shortcomings of particular policies or actions, one misses in Truman any real capacity for reflection. Even those who would be willing to acknowledge that he may have had reason for dropping the atomic bomb are disturbed that it appears to have caused him so little concern. Too much of the time, too, in his behavior toward Congress, toward the press, toward the people, he lacked a sufficient sense of what it means to be presidential. And his much admired qualities of confidence and grit could, especially in his conduct of foreign affairs, take the form of bullheadedness and testiness. Still, the achievements are formidable, and for the present at least, near great appears to be the verdict. It is a judgment that one man at least, Harry Truman, would have been happy to accept. Some years after he left office, Truman reflected, "I wasn't one of the great presidents, but I had a good time trying to be one, I can tell you that."
While we let Professor Leuchtenburg catch his breath for a moment after that tremendous performance, it's interesting to reflect this is only the second of our 6 sessions, and we've already hit an incredible level of brilliance and rhetoric, only matched probably by the time that Lincoln was at Cooper Union himself. And we on our stage are now in the 20th century going to have 6 people who can achieve that level. It takes me back 20 years when I was a student in Dr. Leuchtenburg's course in American political party history, and I can assure you, like so many other former undergraduates and graduate students who took his course, whenever we think about or write anything on 20th century politics, one of the first things we go to is the set of notes that we took from that course. And I'm not alone in that. I know there are some graduate students in the audience who can attest to that fact. Well, if we've given you a chance to catch your breath for a moment, I'd like to ask you a few questions, and actually there'll be very few, and then we will go to the audience. I told Dr. Leuchtenburg to take as much time as he wanted. I remember how great those lectures were 20 years ago, and I wanted to hear as much as I could. You were talking about Truman's accession to the office, and I want to repeat that quote because I had taken it down as well, the David Lilienthal quote. "The country and the world doesn't deserve to be left this way, with Truman at the head of the country at such a time." Left this way. He'd been vice president for 82 days, which wasn't very much, when he took over. Many people fault Roosevelt for leaving Truman so unprepared. So my question would be, was Truman really unprepared? And if so, could Roosevelt have done anything about it? In terms of the transition and the takeover, is there a lesson to be learned here?
If I might diverge just for a moment to comment on your earlier remark about Cooper Union, I was reminded by what you said of what John Kennedy said when he entertained the Nobel laureates at the White House and said that this was the greatest gathering of intellects that have ever been in this room since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. The impression that Harry Truman was altogether unprepared to succeed Franklin Roosevelt is an accurate one. In the period when he was Vice President of the United States, he saw Franklin Roosevelt only twice. He was so closed off from what was happening in the government that he had never met the Secretary of State, Stettinius. At the end of his first cabinet meeting, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, came up to him and said that he would like to talk to him and tell him something alone after the others had left. And he explained a few things about what had been going on, but so circumspectly that Truman didn't quite take in what he was saying, in part because the Secretary of War did not think that it was fitting even then to divulge to the United States that we were building the atomic bomb. That's how unprepared he was. As to Franklin Roosevelt's role in this, I think there are two things that can be said. One is that Franklin Roosevelt accepted, I think accepted is the word more than chose, Harry Truman to be his running mate in 1944 in order to balance the ticket. He wasn't thinking of him really as holding the reins of power. And I think the other thing that I can't prove this, but it's my firm conviction that Franklin Roosevelt did nothing about the apprenticeship of Truman because he never believed he was going to die. I mean, not then, but not ever. That wasn't the kind of thought that would cross FDR's mind. And so Truman, in fact, won the admiration of numbers of people, Omar Bradley, for example, who had a low regard for him at the outset, who saw how hard Harry Truman worked, hour by hour, straining his eyes, reading documents in order to get caught up on what had happened at Yalta and Tehran and in other places.
I'd like to go back to the point that you were making about the Cold War and the judgment of diplomatic historians being very different from the judgment of other historians and the general American public today. Did Truman change course dramatically in dealing with the Russians? I'm thinking now of a number of specific instances. The showdown with Molotov 11 days after Truman took office. This had to do with the Lublin government in Poland. Molotov walks out of a meeting with Truman and says, or actually in the meeting, he protests to Truman, and he says, "I've never been talked to like that in my life." And Truman responds, "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." And there were a number of incidents like that. There's an obvious parallel one can draw with the calculation that Reagan and others make about talking tough to the Russians. But would FDR have handled negotiations in the same way or differently?
Well, you're at the cutting edge of what is a very lively argument among not only diplomatic historians, but historians generally of this period. And it won't surprise you to know that there are historians who think that there's continuity between Roosevelt and Truman, and others who think that there is discontinuity. There are those who think that there's continuity say that in his very last days that Roosevelt had become deeply troubled by the Soviet attitude in Italy toward Eastern Europe. And they point out, too, that the advisors whom Truman relied on were essentially FDR advisors. And Averell Harriman, whom we've come in our later day to think of as being an advocate of détente, came back from Moscow because he was afraid that Truman would not understand Roosevelt's message, which was the importance of toughness toward the Russians. There are others, though, who say, as your question implies, that there was a shift between Roosevelt and Truman, and certainly there is a change of style between the two men. It's hard to imagine that Roosevelt would have made that remark that you have just quoted of Truman's to Molotov. On the other hand, there are those who say that the notion that Molotov, having spent all his life in the Kremlin, was never talked to like that before, has about it aspects of the comical.
Because we'll probably start taking questions from the audience as soon as they come up. I want to take one which is somewhat out of order in a way, but it relates to something we were talking about before this discussion, and that was the question of whether or not Ronald Reagan has the right to call himself the inheritor of the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, and John Kennedy. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that that you could make public.
My main thought about that is that I shouldn't answer the question, and you should all go out and buy my book, in which that is answered, at least by implication, at some length. There's a whole chapter about Reagan and Roosevelt. The curious thing is that in the 1948 campaign, Ronald Reagan headed Labor's League for Truman and Barclay in Hollywood. And so in that sense, he can claim a continuity, but I don't think it's the continuity he has in mind. Clearly, the kinds of policies with which he is now identified depart very markedly from those of Truman's fair deal. I think that the striking aspect of Reagan's constant invoking of the name of Franklin Roosevelt is how the subject matter has changed. 4 years ago, he was quoting out of context certain statements of Franklin Roosevelt to prove that he was in keeping with FDR in favoring a balanced budget. In this campaign, he is once more quoting Franklin Roosevelt, the Franklin Roosevelt who said that it's all right to not have a balanced budget when you have to put the needs of people first. And so the context has changed 180 degrees in 4 years' time. And of course, the big difference is that Roosevelt made that statement about not balancing the budget and putting the needs of people first in the context of advocating the largest welfare program in the history of the United States. In essence, the birth of the welfare state in America, whereas President Reagan's policies have been quite dissimilar from those.
Another question that I thought we could cover before we get the questions from the audience, which I think coming momentarily. If we could go back to the decision to drop the atomic bomb, such noted scientists as Frank and Szilard called for a demonstration of the awesome power of the weapon and not for its use on a Japanese city. I gather they were deflected by the White House advisory system and never got in to see Truman. But can the argument be made that Truman used this weapon as a bargaining position, or used this as a bargaining chip against the Russians? Again, the revisionist historians have suggested that his behavior at Potsdam, when he fairly crowed to Stalin that we had a weapon of enormous magnitude, and Stalin, who had already been tipped off about the weapon, feigned indifference, so they were playing a little game there. Was this really important? Could Truman have done anything other than what he had done?
Well, if I could pick up your first point and then pick on the Russians and then pick up your last question. There have been historians who have argued that Truman dropped the bomb, or authorized dropping the bomb, as a ploy against the Soviet Union. Garel Perovitz is particularly associated with that view. It is not the view of most historians, including those on the New Left, and many of whom are very critical of Truman on this point. The point has been best explored by the historian Martin Sherwin, and it is so complex that I won't try to deal with it in detail. But on your second point, I think even people who regret very much that the bomb was dropped have a certain sympathy for Truman in saying that the situation was already so far along by the time that he took office. All of the wheels were turning in that direction. For him to have halted it, unprepared as he was, not having been elected as he was, with so little authority behind him, to halt this huge project and say that it would not be used would have required an extraordinary action on his part. Furthermore, there are those who do not see the distinction as being one in kind, but in one of degree. When so many thousands of lives had been destroyed in the firebombing of Tokyo and in Dresden, that it's arguable that it was not as great a change as we normally think of it as being. Now, I'm simply making what the case is on Truman's behalf, and I think it's fair to say that those historians and others who are critical of the United States decision to drop the bomb or the bombs in Japan do not focus on Truman as being the primary culprit in the story.
I think one now will go to some of the questions from the audience, and the first one deals with Dean Acheson, who is the Secretary of State, and it's this. Dean Acheson, in his book Present at the Creation, dedicates it to the captain with the mighty heart, meaning Truman. In the same book, he details his reluctance to accept Franklin D. Roosevelt wholeheartedly. Can you elucidate? I assume that means on the reluctance.
Yes. Atchison was a member of the junior cabinet under Franklin Roosevelt in roughly 1933-34. He was, if I remember rightly, Undersecretary of the Treasury, and he strongly disapproved of the financial policies of the early New Deal, in two respects in particular: the unbalanced budget and going off the gold standard, as well as the handling of the London Economic Conference. And he thought that Roosevelt was flighty, irresponsible in the way in which he handled economic policies. It was economic policy rather than foreign policy that he departed from on FDR. And part of this was they were both Grottonians. Part of this was one patrician not respecting another patrician. Atchison did, though, have a very high regard, as is suggested by the question, for Harry Truman. They seemed like an odd couple, but there was a deep affection and respect between the two.
Another question. One can argue that Truman grossly mishandled the Berlin blockade by refusing to directly challenge the Soviets at the height of America's relative strength. How do you respond to this?
Well, there is of course such a view of the Berlin blockade, and there were people who were talking about doing something like sending armored cars through, running a train through. We're here in the area of what historians call the contrafactual history. You're guessing about what the consequence would be. Since they didn't happen, you don't know. I would say that would be, looking at it then and looking at it from the perspective now, more of a risk for less probable gain than I would be willing to take. Now, I have the advantage of knowing. It's a little bit like something like Grenada. You know after the fact that it all turned out all right, or reasonably all right. So that it's easier then to say that Truman did what he should have done, since he got the Russians to back down without war, without danger, without very considerable loss of life. And so from the perspective of hindsight, you know it was successful.
What are your thoughts on Truman's loyalty program? Were there legitimate reasons for it? Did it start us on the road to McCarthyism years before McCarthy himself got started?
Well, the communist issue, if I can back into the question from the last point first, the communist issue was well developed before there was a loyalty program. The Dies Committee had been formed in 1938, and the loyalty program wasn't established until a decade later. There are, though, historians who share the view implied in the last question. There is a book by a man named Richard Freeland called The Truman Doctrine and the Origins of McCarthyism, and that blames Truman for the starting of the McCarthy period. To deal with the first question, were there grounds? I think there were grounds of two sorts. One, there were in fact espionage agents within the federal government, and some of them linked, as the Canadian spy trial revealed, the Klaus Fuchs affair revealed, to agents in other countries. There was some kind of problem. The second argument is that given the fact that the 80th Congress was controlled by the opposition party, and given how much excitement it was creating over the communist issue, Truman probably had to take some kind of action to forestall worse action. So in that sense, it was a conservative move. Having said that, it also has to be said that the that the Truman program swept very broadly, certainly caught up some innocent people, did damage to civil service morale, especially in the Foreign Service, and did help contribute to the overexcitement of the Red Scare that we identify with McCarthy.
Another question relating to the McCarthy period. Truman, who took such a tough, unrelenting stance with the Soviets, was notably less than tough against Joe McCarthy and his crusade against communism and democracy. Do you agree with this assessment?
Well, I think the problem, it was less that Truman was less than tough on McCarthy. McCarthy's Wheeling speech isn't until February of 1950. His impact on the election isn't until that November. Truman has only 2 more years to go, and by then he is, in essence, a lame duck president without an awful lot of power going for him. Nobody in that period, this is something that's brought out effectively both in Robert Griffith's book on the Senate and in Richard Fried's book on the response of the Senate, nobody was able to develop an effective handle on McCarthy. Sometimes it was because people were scared of him, sometimes it was because people half believed in what he was saying, but sometimes it was because he was simply so clever that it was difficult to find a way finally to bring him down.
On a different topic, by the way, I think what we'll do is we'll go to 10 o'clock, and that will be the end of our evening. In view of the turnabout in opinion of Harry Truman, do you think that the same metamorphosis may occur in the future opinion, I guess, of Jimmy Carter?
I'm smiling for 2 reasons. I was on a panel with Jimmy Carter a few months ago in Washington, and I have to introduce him in Chapel Hill in 2 or 3 weeks and make a statement about him. So I've been mulling over this question and sort of taking my own temperature on Jimmy Carter at the moment. There is an extensive oral history program now being conducted at the University of Virginia on Carter. They brought in people from the outside to interview people from the administration. I interviewed Jody Powell, for example, over some hours down there, and there are extensive transcripts. Nothing like this has ever been done before so extensively, so quickly. And I think that there are certain areas where Carter is likely to look better than he did at the time. But a great deal of what a president's reputation is depends less on him or what happened in his own administration than what happens in subsequent administrations. In that sense, for a good historical reputation, you not only want to be good, you want to be lucky. And if it turns out that the present economic surge is short-lived, that we are truly in an age of limits, then Carter's warnings, as in the famous Malaise address, though we never use that word, will seem remarkably prophetic. In my own judgment, that is what's going to happen, and I think he will look prophetic. But that is obviously speculative, and at the moment, he seems out of sync with the popular mood. Again, with respect to détente with the Soviet Union, some kind of international arrangement, one can imagine a course of foreign affairs in which a series of things that happened under Carter, the attempt at an arms agreement, the Panama Canal Treaty, the emphasis on human rights, will seem more significant than they seem now or seem then.
I think this is the last question that we'll do. don't you think that Harry Truman, in wanting to defend the world from communism, opened the door to Vietnam?
Well, this is certainly a judgment that's made about Truman, that the particular point that's made is that the containment policy, while sensible enough for Europe and working out on the whole well enough there, was given global expression, both in Truman's rhetoric and then in application when carried to Asia, and had unfortunate effects. The first serious escalation of the American commitment in Vietnam, wasn't called that then, but in Indochina, was taken under Harry Truman. And you can certainly trace a course of action. On the other hand, it can also be said that there was nothing inevitable about that course of action, that there were numbers of possibilities for detours. Even, and the same question arises with respect to the historical reputation of John Kennedy. There is an enormous difference between the very, very small commitment that there was under Harry Truman and the more than 500,000 troops that there was under Lyndon Johnson. And I think we have to be conscious always of the kinds of continuities that are suggested by the question, but aware of the discontinuities too.
I think we'd all like to thank Professor Leuchtenburg for this wonderful lecture.
That was great fun. Question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
That
much.
was wonderful.
That's correct. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Nice work.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.